This happened December of 2010. I was still a student and was serving as an acolyte in our university's chapel, before I lost my religion and just became agnostic. Like I said, it was mid-December when this happened, around 9 or 10 p.m. Here in the Philippines, we have a tradition called Simbang Gabi. It's a 9-day series of midnight masses. Well, sort of, because the mass starts at 4 a.m., ending at 5 a.m., and would usually have Filipino bread called pandesal and a hot ginger ale called salabat served. We usually sleep in the chapel quarters during these days since we have to prepare all the necessary things we need during Mass, like incense, candles, setting up the seats, and all other miscellaneous stuff needed. To understand it better, I need to explain the layout or structure of the chapel. The main entrance of the university is a long hallway of about 30 meters, and on the left is the chapel. Now the chapel is shaped like a 5-sided semicircle, and on both corners are the quarters. Our is the one on the side where the hallway is connected, and on the other side is where the admin quarters is. I hope that made sense. On the night in question, the older acolytes, including me, were hanging out outside the acolyte quarters, quietly chatting and waiting for the younger acolytes to fall asleep, when out of nowhere, one of the older acolytes, let's call him Marcus, came from the main school entrance, which was the hallway. So we said hi and asked him if he's going to be staying the night, and he said yes, but we found it strange since he didn't have a bag or any type of sleeping paraphernalia, or even a change of clothes with him. He was wearing a plain white shirt, his school uniform pants, and slippers, but we shrugged it off since we have spare shoes and other clothing in the quarters. Marcus didn't respond to our greetings, as if we weren't there. He went straight to the acolyte quarters, and after 3 minutes got out and asked us where the chapel-owned albs were, since he couldn't find it in our quarters. Alb is the suit or robe that acolytes wear during Mass service. We remembered that all of them were in the admin's quarters since they were freshly washed in the laundry house the other day and were being checked for inventory. So we told him to go to the other side of the chapel where the admin quarters is, and he went on his way. Not 5 seconds passed after Mark went to the admin's quarters. The head acolyte, Ronnie, which is my friend to this day, came to us and said, "Hey guys, just got a call from Marcus's mom. Said he can't serve for the rest of the masses since he's in the hospital. He got dengue fever." Every single one of us who saw Marcus and talked to him went pale. One of us said, "But Ronnie, we just talked to him just now. He was looking for an alb to wear for tomorrow." And the rest of us confirmed it. After hearing the news, we prayed for his safety and recovery, and the rest of the night was uneventful. I have more stories to share about that chapel, our school, and some of my experiences with the Shadow Man and demonic-looking entities that stretched for years since I was a kid. I will share them on a different story next time. This story takes place back when I was in junior high. Me and my family lived in this apartment complex that had a small community made out of it. Most of the people knew everyone. That type of small town feel to it. There was nothing really special about that day that this experience happened. I woke up, went to school, walked home because the school was literally right down the street from my apartments. Later that night, everyone went to bed. It was probably around 9 or 10 p.m. because that's a normal time my family went to bed. I was in my bed, which was a separate mattress. My older brother and younger brother had this bunk bed set where a king mattress was underneath a bunk bed. There was also a desk on the right side of the unit. Falling asleep was normal and easy. Nothing was weird or unusual that day. The weird dream started off when, as me standing in what looked like a grass field of sorts, I looked around and instantly recognized it as the backyard area of my apartments. I saw the playground area that was public for all residents about a few yards to my back. When I looked at it, I knew it was still dark because of the night sky and the stars that acted as a bright light source for me to see clearly. I suddenly felt uneasy, like I wasn't wanted here, which was weird because I lived there. I also was worried about being in trouble for being outside so late out at night. I spotted the back door that I recognized as mine and went to slide it open, which was unlocked. The back door leads to the kitchen/office space, where we had a desktop that was visible to everyone. Walking around my own home that time felt weird. It felt like I was unwanted or not invited, kind of like if I was breaking in. I shrugged off this feeling and made my way through the kitchen and to the right, which led to the room side of the apartment. The first room on the left was my older and younger sisters. The one next to it was mine and my brother's room. I opened the door slowly and opened it. This is the part where the story gets weirder. As soon as I entered the room, a strange feeling washed over me, like I was interested in looking around and examining. The first thing you see when you walk in the room is my older brother's mattress and the bunk bed that my younger brother slept in that was on top of the king bed. I shut the door behind me, and I made my way over to my older brother's bed and saw him sleeping soundly and snoring as he often did. I leaned in close to his face, trying to get a closer look, taking in all the details. It seemed like maybe it was my first time seeing him. Then I saw my younger brother breathing. His shoulders rising and falling had caught my eye, so I saw the ladder that was the way to make my way up there. My younger brother was sleeping, and I did the same thing. I got really close and checked him out. I took note of all I was seeing. Then I heard something else behind where the door opens is where my bed is, the single mattress. My bed. I got confused and I started to make my way over to the figure sleeping in the bed. I saw myself sleeping, which really confused me because I was me, and I was seeing me in another place in bed. Cautiously, I raised my hand and stretched out my finger to myself that was sleeping on his stomach. Before I made contact with myself, I shot up and opened my eyes and gasped, but I felt paralyzed. I saw a humanoid figure reaching out to me, and I was desperately trying to close my eyes and trying to look away from what was in front of me. The next thing I knew, it was morning and my family was up and getting ready for school as if nothing was wrong. I decided to try and just pretend nothing happened. When I was in the bathroom that was small, it had a shower and a tub connected and a toilet next to it, and a sink was the first thing you saw when you walked in. As I was brushing my teeth and doing my hair, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I saw that same figure that I saw when I woke up the previous night. Again, I felt paralyzed, my legs locked in place like they had concrete. As the figure reached out their hand, they touched my shoulder and I felt this jolt of electricity run through me, and just as quick as it appeared, it vanished. The weird thing about this is that dream is the only one I've ever remembered. From then on, when I sleep, my time seems to skip today after I close my eyes. I've done research and I believe what I've seen is one of those shadow people that people seem to witness from time to time. I have not seen them since, and I hope I never do. That feeling I get when I saw that figure is one I never want to feel in again. Well, this is a story about a time when I was younger and got visited by apparently a very aggressive ghost. Before I begin, I'd like to say that I have a weird liking for the paranormal and I do believe in ghosts, but I'm by no means a spiritual person. Now I have to give a bit of context here. I was living with my father alone at that time. My mom had moved out and divorced my father around 2013, if I remember correctly. We lived in a fairly big high-rise apartment. Now, to give a better setup for the story, I'll describe my apartment as best as I can from memory, as this story had happened around the spring of 2014. Imagine a wooden door with a glass window. When you enter through the door, you see a long hallway which connects almost to all the rooms. Almost directly behind the entry door on the right side was my room, formerly my brother's, but he had also moved out. Then on the left side was the kitchen. Note, when I would go out of my room, I could only see into one direction of the kitchen. My room wasn't perfectly aligned with its entrance. I'd say a meter away from the kitchen on the left side of the hallway was the guest toilet. It was literally just a room with a toilet and a sink. Further away was the actual bathroom, also on the left side. The hallway ended into my former room, which was also the biggest bedroom in the apartment. Now it wasn't used at all, though. On the right side of the hallway end was the living room, which was actually connected to my father's bedroom, although my dad would often sleep in his big sofa chair while leaving the TV on. Now that was also the case when this story occurred. My father was sleeping on his chair in the living room. My friend and I could actually hear him snore while we were laying in my bunk bed chatting. My friend, let's call her T, and I were around the same age, 13. We were having fun chatting about all kinds of things, and our plan was to stay up all night having fun. Now, I did often have a weird feeling about my apartment. Sometimes I could hear what sounded like footsteps in the apartment above ours, right above my room. My father always assured me that it was probably just the wind knocking the window open, the house settling, or just simply a trapped animal up there. The apartment has apparently always been empty. It wasn't too dirty or anything. I guess people just didn't want to hike all those steps up to it. And so in all my 7 years there, it was empty. It was also the last apartment of the entire building. There wasn't even an attic connected to it. Now, as T and I were laying in my bed, we stared to quiet down once it was close to 8 p.m. I think it was around 9 p.m. when we both heard the steps from above. T was completely stunned, as I had sometimes told her about those steps in between classes, but she never really believed me when I thought aloud that it might have been a ghost. We both listened for a while for these footsteps. They had a somewhat weird rhythm to them because they always came in 3, meaning we'd hear thump, 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 then they'd stop for a few seconds, then start up again in the same pattern. They were always circling in the room above mine. Now we could hear them somewhat well, but they didn't sound heavy, more like a person was shuffling around. My bunk bed was pretty high up, so when I sat up in bed there would only be about 7 inches of space to the ceiling. So we could hear those steps sometimes even pretty close to our heads. When that happened, we hugged and crouched together into one corner of my bed. All the while, my father was still snoring loudly in the living room. The footsteps continued up until 10 p.m. When we thought it was over, we sighed and were about to lay down, but then the steps sounded again and were coming closer to us. We heard the now all too familiar thump, thump, thump. But when they stopped right above our heads, we started to panic. We hoped and prayed that they would walk away, but they didn't. Cold shivers ran down our spines, and we couldn't stop panicking. I don't know how long we just sat there, cowering behind our blankets. We didn't dare to sleep, but I was so scared that I wanted to wake up my dad. "I'll try to go and wake up my father. You want to stay here or come with me?" I whispered to her. She looked at me for a second, then said, "No way am I staying here alone. Honestly, how do you manage living here?" I nervously smiled at her. I was really glad that she was there with me, because at that time she was my only friend. I climbed off the metal ladder that was connected with the bed. I was about to go towards my door, but then I froze. I could hear movement on the other side of my door. T started to whisper, "What's wrong?" Before she could finish her sentence, there was a knock on my door. Now I think she froze too, but I couldn't move to look at her. At first I thought it was my father, but then I realized I could still hear him snoring in the living room. Tears started pricking in my eyes from fear. No one except us 3 was in this apartment. True panic started to rise inside me, but still, I couldn't move, only stare in fear at my door and its handle. Then to both of our shock, there were 3 soft knocks on my door, in the same damn pattern of the steps earlier. Finally, I could bring myself to move again. Carefully, I walked backwards toward my ladder, not breaking eye contact, to my door. When I placed my foot onto the second step of the ladder, the knocks came again, but this time with more force. I still tear up writing this out today, but when I started to climb that ladder, the knocks on my wooden door came even harsher. Now we both were completely terrified and huddled closer together. The knocks became even more aggressive and even turned into full-on banging against my door. But no one else heard. My father was still sleeping through all of this, as we could still hear his snoring, even though the bangs were so loud now. The banging was now almost non-stop, and my door even slightly bent inwards under the force of this ghost, evil entity. I didn't know, neither did T. We both just curled up together and cried, waiting for it all to end. I don't know how long we sat there, but all of a sudden, everything was silent again. Just from one second to another, the banging was gone. Still, we didn't move, and eventually we fell asleep from the adrenaline rush leaving our veins. When we woke up, it was 6 a.m. Even though it was over, we both climbed down the ladder as careful and quiet as we could. It took me a few minutes to actually open my door and look into the hallway. When I did, we both canvassed my entire apartment, finding no one else other than my father still sitting in his chair, still sleeping, although his snoring was now a little more quiet. After that, we finally calmed down. We ate breakfast. However, we didn't speak about last night's event at all. When my father woke up, we did ask him if he had heard any weird sounds last night. but he said he slept like a stone and didn't hear anything at all. When noon came, my dad made pasta, we ate, then I said goodbye to T, and my dad drove her back to her parents. Now it's been 8 years and I still haven't told anyone this story. I don't know if any one of my family members would even believe me, but I swear to everything that I own and everyone I love that this story is true. Remembering this even now brings tears of fear to my eyes. I live in the Philippines. I have experienced multiple paranormal activities ever since I was a child, until I decided no more. We have a family friend who is a healer, and I went to him for help. I asked him to numb my sensitivity for certain things. I have a lot of stories of my first-hand experience, and I'm going to tell you the thing that made me ask for help. I can usually tolerate these things, ghosts, whatever they are. I am not usually easily creeped out, since my grandma have already taught me about these kind of things, the unexplainable. First, I'm going to tell you the outline of my bedroom. Trust me, this is important. My bedroom is on the second floor. The door to my bedroom is on the right side of the stairs. It has 2 wide windows, one window facing the door and the other on the left side of the door. I recently rearranged my furniture at this time, so the headboard of my queen bed is on the right side of the door. This means I have quite a space in between the windows. The door of my bathroom is located to the left side of the foot of the bed, and facing the foot of the bed is my dresser. This means I have a smaller space in this area, just enough for me to walk through. My dad took out the lock to my bathroom. I wasn't sure why. He was always paranoid, and I didn't bother to ask, since I have a lock to my bedroom door. I was thinking I could just lock the bedroom door when I shower. I was taking a shower at around 9:10 p.m., preparing to go to bed. I was sure I locked my bedroom door when I heard a solid 3 knocks. I shouted, "What is it? I'm taking a bath." No answer, and then I hear the door opening. So I quickly got my towel and got out of the door. There he is, standing behind my headboard, my bedroom door wide open. He looked like my brother, but isn't exactly my brother. I can still remember his eyes, a solid black that does not reflect the light, without a bit of shine, and a smile going ear to ear with the edges 2 pointed. He then bent down like he wanted to hide under the bed as sign of play. Without a doubt, and before I could stop myself, I shouted, "I see you." He or it doesn't say a word, but he was already out of my eyesight. I knew it's still there. I could feel its presence. All the hairs in my body is now standing, but I wasn't thinking anymore, I was just doing. So my stupid ass decided to bend down and peek under the bed. Nothing. Nobody is there. I just stood up, hair still wet, with the towel wrapped in my body, walked down the stairs and screamed my lungs out. My brother, watching TV on my grandma's room, shot up out of the bed, asked me what's wrong. I just said, "You have to bite the door." We have a superstitious belief that if you saw a doppelganger, the real person must bite a wooden door to prevent any bad thing from happening. I never got to tell him what happened then, but I was so scared that night that I always slept with the lights on for years. To start off with, at the time of this story, I was a 20-year-old female from Springfield, Illinois. Not nearly as large as Chicago, but just large enough to see new people every day. Home of Abe Lincoln, so we get a lot of tourists, you know, the usual. This happened September 4th, 2018 to be exact. My day went as normal for a Tuesday, got up at 7, went to school, then came home around 3 after having lunch with my mother. I laid down to take a nap, and my ex-fiancé Austin woke me up at 6:30 when he came home from work. He soon left for his second job, and I laid in the guest bed in my office for a few minutes scrolling Facebook. I had been seeing all these stories of women almost being abducted by sex traffickers, and being a 5'7", 325 pounds woman, I never thought it would happen to me. I'm too big, and most of the girls targeted are smaller and easier to grab. About 9, as I'm playing Sims, I remembered that the next day was my dad's birthday, so I texted my ex. "Hey, don't forget tomorrow is my dad's birthday. I'm going to run to Walmart. Do you want me to wait for you to get home, or do you just want me to go?" "You go ahead, I'm tired and I won't be home till at least 10. Just text when you get back." "Okay, I love you. I love you too." I grabbed my purse, slipped on my gray fluff ball shoes, and headed to my car. I'd done this so many nights, even at 3 a.m. when I was bored at the age of 17, so I thought nothing of this excursion at 9 p.m. I pull into the parking lot and park a little ways back, because I just got a new car, and people who go to the Walmart near my house are kind of rude and will just ding your car for no reason. I got into the store, got a cart, and proceeded to grab a cake for my dad and a couple things for dinner the next day. I strolled down the main aisle near the food and turned into the women's section, looking at leggings, then remembering I was there for my father. As I made my way to the men's section on a main aisle, a man caught my attention, standing and staring at a display of children's underwear and holding a couple items in his hands. He smiled at me and said hi, and me, being the polite Midwestern girl I am, smiled and responded, "Hi." As I turned the corner, he called out to me and I stopped, turning in his direction. Now I don't remember the complete conversation, as he spoke very broken English with a heavy Hispanic accent, but it started with him wanting to see a tattoo I have on my back. I'm used to people wanting to see it, so I allowed him to pull my shirt down a couple inches at the collar to see it, and his fingers grazed my spine where the tattoo is. I never gave him permission to touch my body, only my shirt to pull it down, and I turned around. He then started in with, "How are you? You're very sexy. Do you have a boyfriend? Is he here with you? What's your name? How old are you? Do you live around here?" I responded with short to the point answers, and the response to my name was Harley, even though it's not, it's just a name I give to strangers. And he asked to add me on Facebook. I declined, saying I didn't add people I didn't know. He had his phone in his hands, but only the camera was facing me. He didn't let the screen tilt away from his abdomen. Then he asked me a question that chilled me to the bone. "Will anyone notice if you left this area of the store?" I didn't reply, as I was still trying to understand the question, and he elaborated, saying, "Will anyone notice if you left the store?" I responded at this point with, "Yes, my fiancé is out in the car waiting for me, but I need to go. I have shopping to do." And as I tried to turn around, he gave me an unwanted hug, grazing my shoulder and exposed part of my back with his fingers. I left quickly and headed to the t-shirt section of the men's area. I heard the man very close on the next aisle talking on the phone in Spanish. Though I have a Hispanic last name, I know nothing of the language except to say that I don't speak it. I hurried away from that area, making random turns and running down aisles trying to make sure he couldn't find me. As I found myself in the feminine products aisle, I noticed I was getting cold chills, but sweating profusely like I had just ran a mile. I found a bench in the garden center and sat down, grabbing my phone to text my fiancé about the incident. He told me not to leave the store and he would be there as soon as he could. I looked at the time and it was 9:45. How had so much time passed? I didn't even remember being there almost an hour. As I walked the store, he sent me a text saying he was outside. I walked to the front, bought my items, and headed out the front. My ex-fiancé was sitting in front of the entrance in his car waiting for me to come out, and I waved to him. Then I noticed the black truck with windows tinted so dark I couldn't even see inside, that was parked a mere 12 feet from the entrance, facing the wrong way. As I glanced at the truck then to Austin, the truck was thrown into reverse, and the driver sped off through the parking lot and parked at the exit. I hurried to my car and threw my stuff in, locking my doors and not even bothering to plug my phone into the aux cord to call Austin. We got nearer to the exit and the truck's lights never came on, but as we turned onto the new road extension, the truck turned with us. They never turned their lights on or even tried to stay hidden. There was no traffic as we reached the light. I stayed slouched in my seat, praying to whatever God was out there that this person didn't follow me home. As we got nearer to my house, a wave of relief filled me as the truck turned off onto a side road. We got to my neighborhood and took every turn we could, just in case they tried to make it seem like they had given up. We got home and I ran inside as my fiancé stood on the porch scanning both ends of our street. I collapsed on the couch and cried. I talked to an old teacher of mine a little later, and he put out a theory that when the man had touched me, there was a form of date rape drag that was on his wax-covered fingertips that could be absorbed directly into the skin. That's why I got hot with cold chills. I'm not sure what I could have done differently other than ignore him. I'm just glad that I stayed aware of my surroundings and had the smart idea to contact my fiancé. I never thought it would happen to me. Stay safe, ladies. I live in quite the sketchy part of the forest. Yes, there are neighbors next door that you couple happily cough on, if you will. However, in this area there are plenty of homeless people, drug users, and so on. Though I suppose they don't have too much relevance as of right now, except for the crazy stories they use to web a string of lies to scare the locals. Now then, on to the story. I live in what you could call a two-story house, however. It doesn't seem that way to some, as the bottom half of the house is firmly halfway underground, so it's a creepier version of the Monster House from a well-known movie, Monster House. The upper floor has the kitchen, living room, one of two bathrooms, my own bedroom, and my sister's bedroom. In the kitchen there is a sliding glass door that has a porch outside, and to the right are stairs that lead down into backyard, which I feel I should mention is what you could call one of the perfect childhood backyard. Fenced with a fire pit, pool, and playhouse for every small child and dog to run around freely but remain safe. I live in this house with my family, which I won't specify aside from my two dogs, Romo and Bourbon, like the alcohol. Bourbon is our star of the story. It was merely 2 or 3 weeks ago that I had just gotten home from a closing shift at work. It was normal enough. Everyone was asleep, and I was certain my dogs had to go to the bathroom, as it had probably been hours since they'd been out last. I changed from my work clothes and went to the sliding door and called for my dogs as I opened it. However, only Bourbon came and practically shoved me to get out the door, and Romo hadn't even budged from the couch. I shrugged it off and decided I would shower quickly before coming back for Bourbon, who I could hear running around outside. Now, Bourbon is famous for escaping the fence and running the roads, so when I returned from my shower, I poked my head out the door and called for her. There wasn't so much as a sound. I furrowed my eyebrows, opening the door a bit more, and called again, this time clapping my hands for her. Nothing. I groaned, praying she hadn't escaped the fence so late in the night, as I'd be forced to go find her and retrieve her, unlike in the daytime. I begrudgingly came down the steps. As I went down, I noticed embers in the fire pit, which hadn't made much sense as it was far too hot out recently, so we hadn't burned anything in quite some time, but I brushed it off and continued onto the landing. Frustrated and slightly curious, I called her again and even stomped my foot to see if the noise would catch her attention if she was still in the yard. Once again, I was met with silence. I dramatically slid my hand down my face and decided I would go back inside for my slides so I could walk the yard myself without getting my feet too dirty. So I went back up the steps, once again seeing the embers. I grabbed my slides and went back down the steps and finally stepped onto the sand. I was glaring at the fire pit now as I had a strange feeling. I blinked and turned away, going to call for my dog once again. I hadn't managed the first part of her name when I looked down, and there she was, emerging calmly from the pitch black of the night. She sat at my feet, staring up at me like a cute and collected puppy, knowing she was in trouble for making me come all the way onto the sand to come fetch her. I blinked slowly, looking around once again like this wasn't what looked like my dog at my feet. I looked down again, and now she has her tongue out, panting and shimmying where she sat like I had a treat or something for her. I brushed all my skeptical feelings aside, as this was how she normally acted, and on top of all of it the embers were gone, and the night felt normal once again. I sighed, inclining my head to the steps, and told her to head up the stairs, in which she did, and I shortly followed after, making sure the door was locked behind me. As long as I can remember, I've suffered with sleep issues. Insomnia is what it's classified as, but in reality, I just couldn't stay asleep. Every night I would awake sometime around 3 a.m. and wouldn't be able to get back to sleep for hours. As a kid, I would always call for mom or dad, but as an adult, I found more effective ways to put myself back to sleep. Sometimes all I needed was some melatonin or NyQuil. When those didn't work, I would walk the streets of Seattle and listen to music. Now, I know this sounds dangerous, but I'm a pretty big guy. I'm 6'4" and 260 pounds, with most of it being muscle, though God knows I could drop 15 pounds. So despite the risks of the city, I was confident in my abilities to defend myself. Now that the backstory is over, I will get to the story. One night in September, I was on one of my walks. I had my head down and my headphones were blasting metal when suddenly I looked up to see a half-naked man in just jeans sitting on a bench with a broken bottle in his hands. Now, I've seen my fair share of drug users in my day and could tell this guy was on something from his red eyes and detached glare. I had two options. I could either risk walking by this guy, or I could take the alley to my left. Obviously, I took the alley, and after a short walk of me looking over my shoulder to see if the man was following me, I was nearly out of the alley when from behind me I heard a crash, and then an odd wiring sound. I turned to look behind me, but all I saw was the pitch-black alley, but the wiring remained. Now I was playing my music pretty loud, so loud in fact that it could drown out the sound of any passing cars. So the fact that the wiring was overpowering my music was pretty impressive. Suddenly I was blinded by a flash of light, and when I opened my eyes I saw that the alley had been half lit by some ominous red light. The light was bright enough that I couldn't see the source. You really don't understand what the term "frozen in fear" means until you've experienced it yourself. I watched in horror as the lights raised to twice my height. I was snapped out of my fearful trance when the lights began to move toward me, and a clanking sound so loud that it reverberated off my chest was emitted from the pitch-black alley. I ran for my life until I found an all-night coffee shop where I stopped to catch my breath. You might think there's more to this story, but nope. Nothing followed me home, no taps on the window, and I never saw the thing again. It's a weird encounter, but at the time was scared for my life. If anyone knows what that thing was, I would appreciate any insight. I remember commenting to you on YouTube about my story, and you told me to type it up and send it to you, so here I am. Back when I was a little girl, the apartment I used to live in was cozy. My mom used to be a workaholic and perfectionist combined before I was born, and therefore completely spent the entirety of her adrenal hormone on her life before I came into the picture, which made things hard for us while I was growing up. Anyway, I tried to cope with it best I could, and we ended up having some pretty good times together after this experience, which I'm thankful to God that she survived. I barely remember a time where things were normal in my life. This experience gave me severe PTSD on multiple levels that took me nearly 20 years to get over. I'm going to be 24 next month, and I still want to cry thinking about this encounter. I was 4 years old, and like all kids, I was afraid of the dark. But I'd heard about the overactive imagination of children, and so sometimes even at that age I'd chalk seeing something up to that, though there were of course times where I knew I wasn't imagining things. The first time it happened, I was awake after midnight. I was trying to get to sleep when the atmosphere around me felt weird, like a moment in Jurassic Park before a raptor jumps around the corner and tears apart its victim. It's so weird how you know something is going to happen before it does. I kept watching the door, sensing there was something that was just around the corner. I kept waiting for something to come around the doorpost. Then, as I was starting to relax, thinking I was worried for nothing, I saw something come into the room. And I swear that I'm not making this up. It was almost mechanical. It had these lights on, its body like yellow, red, and green beside almost buttons, but not exactly. It had the head of a wolf with a sick, maniacal smile pasted on its face, almost like a serial killer who delighted in murder about to take their next victim, and relishing in the demented pleasure that it gave them. The worst part about its head was that it looked dead. That's the only way I know how to describe it. Its eyes were in a squint that made it look all the more terrifying, frozen in place like it had rigor mortis. As bizarre as it sounds, it didn't walk but wheeled over to me, like some sick animatronic creation straight out of hell itself. It got over to the side of my bed, and just stood there staring down at me, not so much as a foot away, with that same sick smile. I didn't know what to think, what to do. Was there anything I could do? The only thing I could think of was to pray. My mom is a very devoted Christian woman, and did not neglect to teach me how to ward off demons, which I knew this being was one of them. I silently said, "Go away." It didn't do anything, just stayed there in front of me, its smile somehow worse than before. I knew I didn't do it right, and my fear was only entertaining it. I was a quiet child, though, and was scared of making any noise whatsoever, so I just prayed that the blood of Jesus would protect me, and that it wouldn't be able to do anything to me. After I mustered some courage a little louder this time, I said, "Go away in Jesus' name." Its expression changed, like it was irritated at this. I watched in silence as after a moment it seemed to turn away from me, and I don't completely remember if it weed out of the room or if it just vanished. But either way, I was still shaken up. I hoped that that was the last time I would ever see that abomination, but sadly I wasn't so fortunate. The next night it came back, same way, same expression, same terror of the previous night. I hid under the blankets hoping that it would go away, that I'd pull them down off of my face and it wouldn't be there anymore. But when I did, it was still there staring at me like I was a juicy piece of meat that would soon be in its grasp. I hid myself under the blankets again, trying to comfort myself in that false sense of security that having blankets gives a small child. There was one problem though. I got really warm really fast, so much so my mom had given me the nickname of Little Heater. So sadly for me, I couldn't stay under the blankets even to save my own life, which was most likely going to be the cost of my hot-bloodedness. So I took the blankets off of my face and was forced to stare at that thing. We stared at each other for the longest time. I know for a fact it wasn't just minutes because I had a clock on my wall, and I glanced at it by the time it finally left my room and went into the hallway. It was nearly 6 o'clock in the morning and I'd stayed up all night watching this thing so it wouldn't do anything to me. As weird as it seems, I felt like somehow that would stop it from doing anything to me. During this time, my mother was going through some severe health problems, mostly having to do with back issues and fatigue. She'd fractured her back giving birth to me, and my family always thought she was fine because she was the big sister, and she'd always been the one taking care of them. So yeah, they pretty much didn't give a crap about us or our situation. During the time I had these encounters, my mom got really bad. Her skin got really pale, and parts of her hair started to turn white and fall out. I remember there was a wike where all of her hair turned snow white, and her skin started to peel as well, which I didn't really know about till later. She tried to make sure I had the best things that there were, and would occasionally make art for me, though she claimed she was no good at it, which if you asked me is total bullcrap. During the next couple years, I took care of my mom as best as I could. I'd make her food and coffee every day. I'd also patrol the apartment checking on my mom and making sure she was still alive, and that that thing wasn't trying to get at her. I'd sit for what felt like eons just watching her chest go up and down, signaling that she was still breathing. That demonic being would come to my bed constantly. I got so used to it that whenever it came, I would end up taunting it, saying, "What you gonna do, huh? That's right. You're not going to do anything to me." And whenever I had to run to the bathroom at night when it was there, I'd even walk right up to it. Every time I did this, it would end up backing up, making way for me to pass, like it was afraid of me. Personally, I believe it's because I had the power and authority that Jesus gave me, and it didn't want to mess with that. I spent countless nights in the bathroom sleeping on the floor because I didn't want to go back into my room. My mom would always find me in there and ask me what I was doing on the floor. A couple times I lied and said I was hiding from her, which wouldn't make much sense, but it's the only thing I could think of at the moment. Eventually I told her the truth, and thankfully she believed me. She asked me why I hadn't come to her and slept in her bed with her if I was scared. I didn't know how to answer that. For some reason I felt like I had to tough it out. I don't know why. It just felt like I did. I finally told her everything of what happened when I was about 7 or 8, and she was amazed at all that had happened. We found out later that if your skin is peeling and falling off and your hair is white and falling out, it means you are within 3 days of death. It's for this reason that I think what we had in our home was a spirit of death. Not the kind that comes naturally either. The kind that rips your life away whether you're ready or not. Many years later, when I was about 20 years old, I was sitting in my room thinking, and I suddenly turned to look ahead of me, and there it was, just as hideous as ever. I frowned at it and immediately told it to go in Jesus' name. This time it taunted me. "I'm still here," it said in a taunting, amused tone, smile somehow more sinister and dark this time. I asserted myself and said loudly, "Go." Pointing to the door, it still smiled at me, and then boom. I looked to where it was, and it was gone. I found out later that it was my play sword that had fallen down, but there was no way for it to fall on its own, no breeze, no one in the room. I took that as a sign that God had dealt with it, and I haven't seen it since. I still occasionally wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, that is, until my mom described it for me. Its height, size, and everything, and then she told me, I saw it too. We found out later that if your skin is peeling and falling off and your hair is white and falling out, it means you are within 3 days of death. It's for this reason that I think what we had in our home was a spirit of death. Not the kind that comes naturally either. The kind that rips your life away whether you're ready or not. It was end of summer, the year was 1998. I was 18 years old. I had been going through some rebellious times. I was 18 and a junior in high school. I was held back in elementary, and that's why I was so much older than the kids in my class. And to better understand this story. Spring of 1996, my father had fallen ill suddenly, and within a week, maybe two, died from cancer. And I spiraled emotionally and detached myself from the history and ideals my family had, growing up on a cattle ranch and cowboys. I began wearing grunge clothes and turned my back on anything that tied me to any memory of my father. Losing him, I lost a part of myself I don't think I've ever been able to get back or find again. I took interest in things that were dark, sad, and depressive. I also took interest in Wicca and paganism. I became friends with this guy who was Hispanic and spoke fluently in Spanish. We were in the same class. He taught me the ways of Santeria. His mother taught him the ways from a young age, and I began to study Native American medicine and Wicca. I also felt I needed to ground myself a bit, and Buddhism along with Taoism were of interest to me. I had moved out of my mom's house. My mom and dad divorced after I was born, so they shared raising me. But I solely lived with my mom, feeling as though I was being controlled and feeling resistance from her acceptance of me, as well as coming to terms with my sexuality. I moved out and lived in a house with 4 other people. They were the type of people whom acted out D&D, and we had similar interested in movies and music. It was cheap to rent a room and we all got along well. This Hispanic friend, we will call him A, he taught me how to read tarot cards and we played with candle magic. And I was experimenting with cleansing out any negative energy we found anywhere. We had a friend who lived a few houses away, we will call him B, and his bedroom was downstairs in the basement. He complained of not being able to sleep at night and feared any darkness in that basement. A and I suspected something lived there that wasn't good and was messing with our friend. I smudged with sage, we did some cleansing circles, and would recite incantations in Spanish. It all came to head one night because everything we were doing wasn't working. Our friend B was still being tormented, so A decided he would take the entity within himself and break it down and expel it through himself, something that even the most well-versed witches wouldn't attempt, and is typically considered suicide. Being that, if things took a turn for the worst, my friend may not return, and this entity would have total control forever over A. I didn't have a good feeling about this. I was new to practicing, and if things went wrong, I wouldn't be prepared if A needed my help at any time. He casted a circle as I stood by and watched, and began to call the being to him. Candles light the basement, dimly lit the room, and seemed to get darker as something drew close. Since I wasn't part of the circle, supposedly nothing would happen to me. But if things took a turn for the worst, I was to burn some sage. QND began calling A back. I felt nowhere near accomplished enough for this, and decayed it clear if I didn't speak with true meaning, he wouldn't be able to hear me. He began calling to it louder and louder, clapped his hands 3 times. The room got darker and darker, until all the candles extinguished at once. We had 7 candles surrounding him in the shape of a circle, 3 black, 4 white tapers. It went dark and QL fell silent. I had a flashlight and turned it on, shone it towards A. He was no longer laying down. In fact, he had gone from laying static on the floor into a seated position facing me. His eyes were closed. His eyes opened and they were dark, like all pupil. QND, no color whatsoever, even though it looked like A. When he spoke, it didn't sound like him. His eyes were so hollow and made me shiver at the sight of them. And with a menacing grin, he said, "Hello." Insert profanity here to the effect of F***gagot. It was like a 2-tone high and low and sounded ominous. I was scared crapless. I did everything I could not to show fear, but struggled to maintain my composure. I laughed and started speaking some gibberish, possibly Latin, which A didn't know. I hurried and began lighting all the candles again and grabbed my sage stick. And as I did, whatever took A over, shot me a glance, and if looks could kill, I would have been dead right then and there. He blew a kiss at me and ran out of the basement. When A made it upstairs, I followed and so did B. We saw him reach for a knife from the dish drainer in the kitchen, and he began to point it at himself, laughing hysterically, like he was insane. A was obviously not in his right mind, or body for that matter. I immediately lunged at his hand holding the knife and snatched it from his grasp, cutting my hand in the process. I held it up to his face as he laughed maniacally, and I began saying with great force in my voice, "Do as thy wilt, but harm none. Do as thy wilt, but harm none. Do as thy wilt, but harm none." I ran back downstairs, looking at us both, N and I, with his hollow but evil eyes. We decided to remove any sharp object from his sight. My cut was light. The knife was seated but not sharp to slice clean through my finger. It was a scratch. I called upon Mother Earth and the corners for strength and guidance through this ordeal. I know this sounds hard to believe. I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing and was skeptical and thought maybe A was just putting on an act. Though this was unlike him. It was definitely out of character. Nothing could explain his eyes being dilated to the point of no color, and the voice which sounded somewhat like him, but off. A was back in the basement, sitting in the center of the circle. He began ranting and yelling obscenities at me and himself, referring to both of us as homosexual slurs, and looked at me directly. I never once blinked, and deep down inside I was scared. I continued calling to A, yelling his name over and saying, "Follow my voice," the entity within. A cackled and said, "He's mine now." I threw my hands up into the air, called loudly to Mother Earth for strength, and called to A louder and louder. B stood behind me holding the sage while it was still burning. I continued to laugh and speak some form of demonic gibberish. As the candles grew dim again, slowly they began to go out one by one. B turned the light on after the room went dark. As soon as he flicked the light on, A, in a seated position, was rubbing his eyes in the well-lit room now, coughing and gagging for air, like he had been held underwater for a long time. I said, He said, "Yeah, it's me," clearing his throat and shaking his head as if trying to shake off the daze and have he was in. I said, "Close the circle." He mumbled the exit of the circle. I took the sage from B and walked clockwise around him. I lit one white candle and gave thanks to all the powers and entities I called on for aid and strength, and then slapped A across the face, and it was like he snapped out of his daze. I know this probably seems so far-fetched, and will not believe me when I've tried to explain this experience. People laugh or just ignore me. I've kept this a secret for over 20 years because of it, but I witnessed a possession, and it happened because my friend A was stupid and careless about it. I told A never to do that again. I don't care if it expelled this entity away. Sage does the same thing. I don't mess with Ouija boards and will not. Will not participate in anything like this and haven't since. A person whom is willing to volunteer their own body to something dark and unnatural is just asking for trouble. It's why I don't like seeing hollow eyes and won't watch possession videos. Thank you for sharing my story. I wish everything good health and wonderful life with good medicine and white energy. Blessed be. I've always had issues sleepwalking and sleep talking, but I never had sleep paralysis until I was 12 years old. I'll never forget the fear I felt as I woke up on my back with a pressure on my chest and realized I was unable to move. I always fall asleep on my side, so this was not normally how I woke up anyways. My eyes adjusted to the room and I looked towards the foot of my bed, where the black silhouette of a man was standing and just staring. I couldn't make a sound or do much of anything besides blink and beg my toes to twitch or something. His eyes glowed yellow, and I was never able to tell if he had a hat since my room was ridiculously dark. He was at least 7 feet tall, but he didn't seem malicious, and I actually fell asleep staring at him. I woke up in the morning still on my back, but able to move. He became a repeat visitor and appeared once every other month for a while. I remember once I had dozed off on the couch while my family watched a ball game and woke up paralyzed with him sitting by my feet. This was in a well-lit area, and he was like gazing into a black hole with 2 yellow spots for eyes. He patted my knee and vanished, though it took a little longer for me to move. No one noticed my struggles or noticed him, and he would have been very hard to miss. I started to notice his presence even when I couldn't see him, and well, it's comforting. When I was 15, I went on a church retreat to Tennessee for a huge conference. A friend slept in one bed, I shared a bed with my mother, and my twin and grandmother took the main bed, which was in a separate room with a sliding door divider. I woke up, but I was not in control of my body. I remember everything, but it was like I was viewing things as a stranger behind my own eyes. I frantically jumped out of bed, startling my mother awake, and bolted to the sliding door, which was locked, and started frantically trying to claw at the door and rip it open. My mother, very groggily, asked me, "What the heck are you doing?" And my mouth, without my consent, replied, "He's here, I need to stop him. He's going to hurt her." Obviously, I was thinking, what am I saying? Why am I saying it? Why can't I stop? But then the shadow man appeared in my peripheral vision and grabbed my forearm. I blinked, and I was on the other side of the locked door with him beside me. Standing in front of us was what I can only describe as a demon, a monster, limbs bending in the wrong directions, unnaturally skinny, and so tall it was hunched over, exactly over my sister's cot. I could hear my grandmother snoring, and I saw my sister peacefully sleeping, unaware of anything. I was immediately scared, but also angry. I mean, how dare anyone threaten my twin sister? Then that demonic entity turned and made eye contact with me. I felt like my very soul was paralyzed in fear. He grinned at me, lips stretching much further than should have been possible, and his teeth were sharp and jagged. It's like he was taunting me. Then the shadow I had come to call a friend placed a cold hand on my shoulder, and I heard a voice in my head saying, "Go sleep, I will keep her safe." And I once again blinked to find myself staring back at the door from the other side. My mother at this point was understandably freaked out, and as I turned back to bed feeling drained of all energy, I just said, "He's helping, it's okay now." And as soon as I hit the pillows, I was out again. I woke up the next morning to my mother telling me everything. It seems the moment I was pulled through the door, my physical body just stopped and stared blankly at the door. This lasted roughly 5 minutes from what she can remember, and nothing she did would snap me out of it. I have no clue what she tried, because I think I was forcefully astral projected. Still, I have not seen my shadow friend much since, and I have never seen the demon again. I have seen him briefly since starting and graduating college, always at my sister's apartment. She's terrified of the paranormal, so I've never told her, but I know he's not malicious. In fact, the very last time I saw him, I was not even paralyzed. He walked through her apartment, almost like someone doing a walkthrough, and stopped when he saw me. He has no mouth, but I felt like he was smiling, and I almost cried. I was so overjoyed to see him again. I do miss his presence, but I rest easy knowing my sister is safe from what she fears the most, because she's protected by what she fears the most. Ironic, but I'll always remember growing up that for a few years my shadow had a friend. So, I'm a 20-year-old man from a rural part of South Carolina in the Low Country. Won't give an exact place for obvious reasons, but my whole family is from here, and I currently live in a small town not far from where I'm from. To sum it up so no one will get confused, my uncle, cousins, and aunt live where I'm from still, and me, my mom, my siblings, and stepdad live in this small town. I grew up hunting and fishing, mostly fishing, while my other family mostly hunted. While I'm currently writing this, May 10th, 2024, I am only about 6 months from when my first creepy encounter happened. I've had 2 experiences, the first one being not so bad, second being very scary. So let's go ahead and get into it. I've always heard about sleep paralysis, but never really believed in it. I believe in spirits and ghosts, but for some reason never anything like sleep paralysis. When I heard you wake up but can't move, seeing figures and not being able to do anything about it, I never really paid any of those stories mind. That was until it happened to me. So one night, about 8 months ago, I was in my bed falling asleep because I of course had work the next day. And also, so no one gets confused, me and my brother share a room in our family's house. So anyways, I fell asleep with everything off in our room, and I woke up from a loud ringing in my ear. Thinking it was an alarm or something, I opened my eyes and tried to check my phone but couldn't. I couldn't move at all, freaking out. Couldn't even talk, only could look around. So I look at my brother as he's sleeping, and while freaking out, I'm also thinking, how does he not hear that ring? At this point, I feel paralyzed and somehow move the tip of my finger and snap out of it. I wanted to scream and yell, but for some reason I didn't. I was too shocked to do anything, to be honest. I told my sister, and she knew immediately what it was. I didn't want to wake anyone up that was asleep, so I just went back to bed. Nothing happened for a while after that, but fast forward about 2 months later, it's hunting season in South Carolina. For those who don't know, in our game zone, hunting season with rifle starts August 15th, January 1st. So it's like November, I'm going to assume, and me and my cousin are going hunting on my uncle's land where I grew up. We plan to get up early before daylight, about 5 a.m., so we could be ready when the deer start coming out. I'm not a great morning person, at least not that early unless it's for hunting or fishing, then I'm ready to go. So the next day we are getting up and putting our hunting clothes on. Went and grabbed our guns and talked about what stand we wanted to take because there are 4 and only 2 of us hunting today. I chose to take the middle row stand, which is what we call it because it's basically in the middle of where general hunting land is. So we start walking in the woods. He leaves me to go to his stand and I go to mine. Keep in mind it's about 5:30 in the morning and we are both tired still. Anyways, I get in my stand, set my gun to the side, and basically wait for daylight to come out. I get on my phone and scroll through social media with my sound and brightness down until then. I lay my head to the side on the deer stand, tired but not tired enough to go to sleep. I close my eyes when all of a sudden I hear this sound. I had my eyes closed but wasn't asleep. Wasn't far from sleep, but definitely awake enough to know what was going on. So I think nothing of it, thinking it was my uncle's dog because sometimes he'd make his way back in the hunting trail. But it's not like a dog running through the woods. It sounds more like a human, if you know what I mean. Maybe it's me, but animals tend to not make as much noise as a human carelessly walking through the woods. Now, I still didn't think nothing of it, until I heard what sounded like a little boy singing. I listened closely, trying to figure out what he was saying, but I really couldn't tell. I just know he was singing something. At this point, I didn't even want to open my eyes because I was scared. Hearing a little boy singing while it's dark in the woods. Screw that. I would have got out the deer stand and just left. I felt safer in it. Hearing him walk through the leaves on the ground, getting closer to the point where he was right behind my deer stand, then all of a sudden, stop. I was like, what the heck? I said to myself, there's no way this actually happening. I got to be dreaming. About 2 minutes go by and I hear the stepping again, but this time up the deer stand steps. The deer stand sits up about 20 feet high with a built-in ladder getting in, I forgot to mention. So all I hear is the little boy coming up the ladder slowly but not singing anymore. At this point, I'm an inch away from a heart attack. I thought to myself, I have a gun, but if it's a ghost it won't help. Finally, I heard him, or whatever it was, get up the last step, like it was right on the other side of me with the wall of the deer stand blocking him. I kept my eyes closed, hoping it was a dream. I know this might sound unreal, but I kid you not. Out of nowhere, a little boy's voice came right into my ear saying stuff super fast, like he was right there beside my, whispering in my ear. Whatever he said was so fast I couldn't understand anything. I snapped out of whatever I was in and everything stopped. I still stayed in the stand until the hunt was over. Me nor my cousin got a deer. I told him about it and basically all my family besides my uncle. I know he would just laugh at me. Everyone for the most part seems to believe me, but doesn't take it as serious as I do. I can't blame them. I probably wouldn't believe it either. I still went hunting after that, of course, not going to let something like that scare me forever, but it definitely shook me. I always ask myself, though, was that sleep paralysis? I don't think I was asleep. Was I in some kind of trance? Could it have simply been a ghost? What did it say to me? I have no explanation. Although I was caused no harm, but either event, I don't wish it on anybody. It's just creepy, man. I don't really like talking about my childhood much. It's not that anything particularly terrible happened. It's just that things were kind of rough after my parents split up. I ended up living with my dad, which wasn't always easy. He had a bit of a temper, especially when he'd been drinking, which was more often than not. He never got violent or anything, but let's just say he wasn't winning any Father of the Year awards. School was my escape. I actually liked learning, and it got me out of the house for a good chunk of the day. The only downside was the walk. See, we lived a ways out of town, down this long, winding road that cut through a pretty dense patch of woods. It was a solid 45-minute trek one way. During the spring and summer, it wasn't so bad. The trees provided some nice shade, and there was something kind of peaceful about being out in nature like that. But man, when fall hit and the days started getting shorter, that walk took on a whole different vibe. It was early October, I remember, when I first started noticing something off. It started with little things, sounds mostly. You know how the woods have their own sort of ambient noise? Birds chirping, leaves rustling, that kind of thing? Well, I started hearing rustles that seemed too heavy to be caused by any bird or small animal. It was like there was something bigger moving around in there, just out of sight. I tried not to let it get to me, but I couldn't shake this feeling of being watched. You ever get that prickly sensation on the back of your neck, like someone's eyes are boring into you? That's how I felt every single day on that walk. And then there were the dead animals. I mean, seeing roadkill wasn't unusual on a country road like that, but this was different. These were woodland creatures, rabbits, possums, even a fox once, and they weren't hit by cars. They were mutilated, torn up in a way that made my stomach turn. I remember one day I was walking along, trying to ignore the uneasiness that had pretty much become my constant companion at this point, when I heard it. A low, guttural sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was coming from the woods to my right, and it sounded close. I picked up my pace, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to run because somehow that felt more dangerous, like it would trigger some predatory instinct in whatever was making that sound. But I walked as fast as I could without breaking into a sprint. The sound came again, louder this time and closer. It was like a growl, but not quite. There was something almost human about it, and that just made it worse. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. There, about 30 yards back, just barely visible through the trees, was a shape. It was big, way bigger than any dog or wolf, and it was moving in a way that made my skin crawl. It was crouched low to the ground, almost crawling, but its front limbs were too long, the angles all wrong for a four-legged animal. I turned back around and walked even faster, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. I could hear it behind me, moving through the underbrush, keeping pace with me. I was terrified to look back again, scared of what I might see. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The woods went quiet, except for the thundering of my own heartbeat in my ears. I risked another glance back, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road and the silent trees. I practically ran the rest of the way to school that day, and for the next week, I was a nervous wreck on that walk. I jumped at every sound, my eyes constantly scanning the trees for any sign of that thing. But I never heard it again, and I never saw any more mutilated animals. I almost started to think I'd imagined it, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then about 2 weeks after that first incident, something else happened that convinced me it was all too real. It was a foggy morning, the mist so thick I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. I was walking to school as usual, my unease heightened by the eerie stillness the fog brought with it. And then, through the swirling mist, I saw it. It was hunched over on the side of the road, maybe 50 feet ahead of me. At first, my brain tried to process it as a dog, maybe a wolf. But as I got closer, I realized it was dragging something, and it wasn't using its mouth. It had the limp body of what looked like a possum or a raccoon gripped in its front paws. But they weren't paws, not really. They were too long, the fingers too articulated. It was using them to drag the carcass off the road and into the woods in a way no normal animal could. I must have made some sort of noise because its head snapped up and it looked right at me. Its eyes were a bright, sickly yellow, and there was something disturbingly intelligent about the way it stared at me. Like it recognized me, like it knew I'd seen it before. I was frozen, my feet rooted to the pavement in terror. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, though it could only have been a few seconds. And then, quick as a blink, it turned and vanished into the trees, dragging its grisly prize with it. I don't remember the rest of the walk to school that day. I don't remember much of anything from the rest of that day, honestly. I was in a daze, my mind reeling from what I'd seen. I knew I should tell someone, but who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself. After that first sighting, I was pretty shaken up. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even my best friends, Jeffrey and Carter. I guess I was afraid they'd think I was crazy or something. But a couple weeks later, I didn't have much choice. It was a Friday night, and by some miracle, my dad had actually agreed to let Jeffrey and Carter sleep over. He wasn't usually big on me having friends over, so this was a pretty big deal. We had this whole night planned out. Video games, junk food, the works. The only catch was they had to walk home with me first. They lived on the other side of town, so it made sense for them to just come straight to my place from school. I remember being kind of nervous about it, given what had happened the last time I walked that road. But I figured with the three of us together, it wouldn't be so bad. We set off right after last period, joking around and talking about all the stuff we were going to do that night. For a little while, it almost felt normal, like any other day. But then, as we got further down the road and the trees started closing in around us, things got quiet. It was Carter who noticed it first. "Hey, do you guys hear that?" he asked, stopping in the middle of the road. We all went silent, listening. At first I didn't hear anything, but then faintly, carried on the breeze, came the sound of howling. It was distant, but it was definitely getting closer. "Probably just a dog," Jeffrey said, but he didn't sound too sure. We started walking again, a little faster this time, but the howling kept getting louder, and soon it was joined by another sound, heavy, thudding footsteps like something big was running through the woods parallel to the road. "What is that?" Carter whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was in my throat, and all I could think about was that day 2 weeks ago, the thing I'd seen crouched by the side of the road. And then we heard the growling. It was low and guttural, and it sounded close, really close. "Run," I managed to choke out. "Run." We took off down the road, our backpacks bouncing against our spines, our feet pounding the pavement. But the sounds from the woods kept pace with us, the growling getting louder, the footsteps getting heavier. Suddenly, Jeffrey veered off the road, heading for a big oak tree. "Up here," he yelled, jumping to grab a low-hanging branch. Carter and I followed him, scrambling up into the tree as fast as we could. We climbed high, higher than was probably safe, our arms and legs shaking with fear and exertion. Finally, we reached a cluster of sturdy branches and stopped, huddling close together. Below us, the sounds from the forest had gone quiet. All we could hear was our own ragged breathing and the pounding of our hearts. "What the hell was that?" Carter panted, his face white as a sheet. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. I was scanning the ground below, searching for any sign of movement, and then I saw it, a shadow, big and black, moving silently out from between the trees. It paused at the base of our oak, and I swear it sniffed the air, like it was trying to catch our scent. My blood turned to ice in my veins as the thing started to growl again. It placed one hand, and I say hand, because that's what it looked like, not a paw, on the trunk of the tree. It almost seemed like it was testing it, seeing if it could climb up after us. We held our breath, hardly daring to move. I was sure it was going to start climbing, that it was going to get us, but after a moment that felt like an eternity, it dropped back down to all fours and took off down the road, back the way we'd come. We stayed up in that tree for a long time, long after the sounds of the creature had faded away. None of us wanted to be the first to climb down, in case it was still out there, waiting for us. Finally, when the sun started to set and we knew we couldn't stay up there all night, we made our way back to the ground. We didn't talk much on the rest of the walk to my house, just kept glancing over our shoulders, jumping at every little noise. When we got to my place, we locked all the doors and windows, even though we'd never bothered to do that before. We tried to act normal, to go ahead with our plans for the night, but our hearts weren't in it. We were all too shaken up. I think Jeffrey and Carter half believed that we'd just psyched ourselves out, that it had just been a dog or something, and we'd overreacted, but I knew better. I knew what I'd seen weeks before, and I knew that whatever that thing was, it wasn't a dog. We never talked about it much after that night. I think we were all trying to pretend it hadn't happened, but I could tell that walking home from school wasn't the same for any of us anymore. Jeffrey and Carter started taking the bus, even though it added an extra hour to their trip. And me? I started carrying a knife in my backpack, even though I knew deep down that it wouldn't do much good against something like that. Life went on, as it tends to do. The memory of that night started to fade a little, pushed to the back of my mind by homework and chores and all the other stuff that fills up a teenager's life. But it was always there, lurking in the shadows of my thoughts. And sometimes, when I was walking that road alone, I would catch myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. I never saw the creature again, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching me from just out of sight. It's been years now since all of this happened, but I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm out in the woods, which isn't often these days. My name is Amelia Gray, 25 years old, and this happened to me in October of 2015. I was a graduate student in psychology at a small university in the Midwest, working on my thesis about the effects of trauma on mental health. I had always been fascinated by the human mind and its many mysteries, and I spent most of my free time reading about psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy. I lived in a small apartment off campus, surrounded by cornfields and woods. It was a peaceful and quiet place, perfect for studying and writing. I spent most of my days holed up in my apartment, typing away on my laptop, and taking breaks to walk in the woods or read in the park. One evening, as I was walking back to my apartment from the library, I noticed a strange figure lurking in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just a stray animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. They were tall and gaunt, with long fingers and sunken eyes. They were dressed in tattered and worn-out clothes, and they seemed to be watching me. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I quickened my pace, but the figure didn't move. They just kept watching me, their eyes fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. I didn't dare look back, fearing what I might see. I just kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest until I reached the safety of my apartment. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the image of the figure lingered in my mind, haunting me. I couldn't concentrate on my work, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure again. Days turned into weeks, and the figure became a regular presence in my life. I would see them everywhere, in the woods, in the park, even in my dreams. They never spoke to me, but their eyes seemed to bore into my soul, as if they were trying to communicate some dark and sinister message. I became withdrawn and isolated, afraid to leave my apartment or interact with anyone. My friends and family grew concerned, but I couldn't explain what was happening to me. I just knew that I was being stalked by some malevolent presence, and I didn't know how to escape. One night, I woke up to find the figure standing in my bedroom. They were closer than ever before, their eyes blazing with an otherworldly intensity. I froze, paralyzed with fear, as they reached out a bony hand and touched my face. Everything went black. When I came to, I was lying in a hospital bed surrounded by doctors and nurses. They told me I had been found unconscious in my apartment with no signs of forced entry or struggle. They thought I had just fainted, but I knew the truth. The figure had been there, and they had done something to me. I never saw the figure again, but the experience left me shaken. I dropped out of school and moved away, trying to escape the memories of that terrible time. But the image of the figure stayed with me, haunting me to this day. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm convinced that the figure was a manifestation of my own subconscious, a symbol of the darkness that lurks within us all. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened, reading books on psychology and philosophy, talking to therapists and experts. But the truth is, I'll never know for sure what happened that night. All I know is that I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of being stalked by some malevolent presence that seemed to know my deepest fears. And I'll never forget the touch of their bony hand on my face, a touch that seemed to awaken some deep and primal fear within me. It's a feeling that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life, a reminder of the darkness that lurks within us all, waiting to pounce. Here is the expanded story in English. Hello, my name is Jack, and what I saw that one night will scar me forever, and yet no one will ever believe me. I was about 13 at the time and was on a trip to Kentucky, staying at my grandparents' house for the week. Their house was surrounded by woods, and there was one spot where there was a clear opening. The grass was tall, but just short enough for my 5 feet self to see the whole opening. It was also on native grounds, and I would see markings on trees, but it never bothered me because they looked old. It was a very good trip until the night it happened. Me being the outdoorsy kid I was, I wanted to start a fire for my family, but I ran out of wood for the fire. It was about 12 at night, and I went to go get some wood by the tree line until I heard a scream. It sounded like my parents, and my curiosity got the best of me, so I went to go check it out. But my dad stopped me dead in my tracks. He said he heard it too, and that's when I knew this thing wasn't my dad at all, and I didn't know what it was. My dad had a flashlight, and he saw in the tall grass what looked to be an 8 feet pair of eyes. They were orange, and my dad whistled at the thing, and it whistled back in the same exact tone. Me and my dad bolted away, and that thing let out the worst scream I have ever heard. What I saw, I don't know, but I hope to never see it again. After that, we went back to the house, and we were all shaken. We tried to sleep, but we couldn't. We were all hearing noises outside, and we thought the thing was going to come back. The next morning, we went out to check, and we found markings on the trees. They were new this time, and they were strange. We had never seen anything like them before. After that, we decided to leave the house and go back home. Since that day, I have never gone back to that area again. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't know what it wanted. But I know I don't want to see it again. That night left a scar in my memory, and I hope I never forget it. Years later, I was talking to my friend about what happened, and he asked me if I thought that thing was from another world. I told him I didn't know, but I knew I didn't want to see it again. He said that there are a lot of things in this world that we don't understand, and it's possible that there are other things in this world that we don't know about. I thought about what he said, and I think he's right. There are a lot of things in this world that we don't understand, and it's possible that there are other things in this world that we don't know about. But I know I don't want to see it again, and I hope I never forget that night. Now I'm older, and I think about what happened that night. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't know what it wanted. But I know I don't want to see it again, and I hope I never forget that night. That night left a scar in my memory, and I hope I never forget it. Lucy was a 13-year-old girl who moved to a new town with her parents. They bought an old small house which they furnished in an old-fashioned style. Lucy's bedroom was on the ground floor, and her parents' bedroom was on the upper floor. As time passed, Lucy's parents noticed that something was wrong with their daughter. Her health was deteriorating week by week. She became paler, thinner, and weaker. It was so bad that she couldn't even climb the stairs to the upper floor alone. Lucy's parents were desperate and called their family doctor to come immediately. The doctor arrived soon and examined Lucy thoroughly. He diagnosed her with anemia, also known as blood deficiency. Since Lucy was still young and could articulate herself, the doctor decided against hospitalizing her. He prescribed her some tablets and told her parents that she should recover quickly. The parents were relieved, and the mother immediately went to the pharmacy to get the medication. However, from day to day, Lucy's condition worsened. Her parents were completely desperate and didn't know what to do. She was now deathly pale, unresponsive, and her cheeks were completely sunken. A terrible sight. But then came the moment they had feared the most. When the mother went to Lucy's room in the morning to check on her, she found Lucy dead in her bed. The world came crashing down for the two parents. Their child was dead. Lucy was buried within a week, and the death certificate stated the cause of death as anemia, blood deficiency. The parents couldn't comprehend their daughter's death. She was still so young and had been perfectly healthy before the anemia started, which began after they moved into the new house. A day after the funeral, the mother went to Lucy's room to mourn, but when she stood in front of her bed, she saw 2 red spots on the white pillow. Then she saw something moving in the pillow. She immediately ran to the kitchen, grabbed a sharp knife, and slid open the pillow. Frantically, she shook out the contents onto the floor. The floor was covered in white feathers within seconds. Then something slowly crawled out of the feather pile with long, hairy legs. It was a monstrous, pitch-black spider, so full of blood that it could hardly move. Night after night, while Lucy lay in her bed sleeping, this hairy, monstrous spider had secretly sucked out all the blood from her body, slowly draining the life out of her. This took place from what I can remember 10 years ago. I was living in Wales at the time, and behind my house was a massive field which you could walk to the doctor's surgery and the church. At nighttime, the field used to give me the creeps, as it would always be reflected in the dark, as something you would see in a horror film, like the water glowing in the moonlight, and the darkness casted over the field. I was 12 years old at the time. I used to enjoy playing and jogging in the field with my dog Millie. She was a rough collie who was getting to quite an old age, but she still had some playfulness left in her old bones. She and I went into the field at night. To give a small overview of my old house, there was steps from the back door to the road behind the back garden. You would walk past a tree line, then the metal gate to the field was there. We took a jog into the field and it was quite fun time. We did the usual games anyone would do with their dogs, like fetch the stick, run and chase, and other fun games. The field was only partially well lit by the nearby street lamps, but the back area was dark and spooky. I would often hear noises from the field which could range from howling to whispers, but I shrugged it off as a farmer and dog, as across a small stream was a farm. When I was about to venture further into the field, Millie began to growl. Now Millie was getting old and her eyesight was partially gone, but she stayed almost still and snarling at something in the darkness. I just told her it is a farmer and his dog, but when I looked in her direction, I froze. Standing there was man, but the thing about this man was his arms and posture. He was hunched over and his arms stretched to about his legs. I shouted, "Hello, my dog means no harm. She is just not used to seeing anybody at this time of night." In my head I heard, "means no harm." Panic began to strike me. I tried to play it off as me overreacting, but then the man changed. He or it was no longer a man. It morphed into a dog, but the back legs were too high and its back was more arched like a werewolf, but more straight. It let out a big screech and charged at me and Millie. I began to run with Millie and Toll, and we got over the fence with me lifting Millie, who was a very big but not impossible to lift. I ran back to my back garden, locked the gate, and ran up the stairs. I looked back from the top, and the thing was there, partially illuminated in the light, and it stared at me, then ran back into the field. My dad was quick to the kitchen and asked me what was wrong. I told him, and he just told me that I was just seeing things and to go to bed. I did, and that night was full of creepy events. The first was at around midnight. I was thirsty and went down for a glass of water. As I headed down to the kitchen, I heard a tapping at the back door. At first I thought I heard my dad's voice asking me to let him in as he forgot his keys. I thought, hang on, my dad and mom were asleep next door to mine. I crept back through the lounge and back up the stairs to my room and looked out my bedroom window, which overlooked my back garden, including the back door. I looked, and there was the same man from the field, but he was looking at me, and I quickly closed my window and drew my curtains. It had a crooked mouth and huge glowing eyes. I hid under my covers and fell back asleep. The second event happened the following night. I was in bed early after a long day of school and small chores around the household with my mom and dad, including walking the dog and shopping down our local grocery. I fell asleep, and at around 1 a.m. I woke up and decided to play on my PS2, yes, a 2000s kid. I played on the horror game Resident Evil 4 and was enjoying the game when I muttered under my breath, "Just a zombie." I heard a voice mimic mine and it said the same thing, "Just a zombie." I paused my game and was shaking as I noticed that voice from the previous night. I looked outside my window and it was there again, but it was almost a staggering 9 feet tall and was looking through my window, and it stayed there until I fell asleep. The last event that occurred was when I was at home on my own. My dad was working and my mom went to see my cousin a few miles away, and I was alone. I played on my trampoline and then went to my room to have a games night. My dad was not due to be home till 12 at night, and my mom would pick him up after he caught the bus to his job, which was 15 miles away in another town. I settled down with a big pizza and my own custom-made Coke and mango mix with ice in a big pint glass. I was playing some games when all of a sudden I heard a knock at the back door and thought, maybe Mom forgot something. As I made my way down, I froze. Mom went to see my cousin and my dad was working the night shift. How can they either be back as the buses stopped running after 6? I also recalled the last 2 nights with that thing. I peeked behind the lounge door, but nothing. I felt it was my imagination, but then I heard my name. It called my name, Joshua. I looked at the back door again, and the thing was there. Millie was barking at it after it began tapping, and I called her to quietly follow me. She listened and came to me whimpering, but I told her it will be okay. I took her and my cat, who was hissing at the creature, upstairs and locked the door. I waited there, lights off and windows drawn. I then heard more snapping bones, and it began screeching. I looked out the window, and it ran into the field. I saw the headlights of my mom in her car pull up behind the back gate, and I ran out to ask her if she saw it, but she did not. I was relieved to see my mom, but was irritated by what I kept seeing. Almost 7 years later, at 19, I had to know what I saw all those years ago, and after asking around and explaining my experiences, they told me what I witnessed was a skinwalker or a Wendigo, but I thought as a young horror fan they were native to America, but some must have been in the United Kingdom long ago. All I am happy with is we moved back to England, and when I visit the area, the field has been locked firmly. I just hope somebody else was not their next victim. Well, what can I say? It's another skinwalker story. Personally, I keep an eye and ear out for paranormal activity, so if something comes along my way eventually, I won't be surprised. However, this account is on a friend of mine. I like to call her M. I recall talking to her about a certain camping trip she went on in Colorado about 2 years ago. I wasn't there myself, but I remember her coming back from that trip. What struck me odd was that 1, she came back later than her friends did, and 2, she was very hesitant on telling me what happened on that trip. Eventually, she spilled the beans on her account of a skinwalker. When she told me the story, I was very shocked. I asked her friends that had went with her on the trip about the topic, and they too had a bit of a story to tell. Nothing as extreme as M's account, though. I haven't thought about it until it was brought up to me by my twin brother. He got M to tell him the story too. We talked about it for a while, and after that conversation I thought it was time, with permission from M of course, to share the tale of M, the medicine man, and the skinwalker. Like I said, it was about 2 years ago. M's spring break was coming up. Her friend, me and my twin, called Trigger Happy, invited M to a week-long hiking trip in Colorado. She accepted the invitation and took all the necessary preparations. M, Trigger Happy, and 3 more friends accompanying them left on the Friday before the official week of the spring break. Since M, me, and everybody I have mentioned so far lives in Michigan, they flew to Colorado, rented a cheap car, and stayed at a cheap motel not too far from the airport. On Saturday, they drove to their destination, unloaded the hiking camping gear, and hiked a short distance to a good camping spot. The first 3 nights were rather uneventful, in M's words. She said that only Trigger Happy and one of the other friends had experience in overnight hiking trips, so they moved slowly through the forest. On the 4th day, during the late evening, the group heard what they thought were just animal noises. However, Trigger Happy informed the group that he didn't think those were animal noises. The group began to listen more intently, and they too realized the unnatural characteristics of the noises. EM described the noises as a man trying to imitate a coyote howling or barking, but the attempt was very close to the actual sound of one. The noises eventually stopped, and they finally retired for the night. On the last night of their planned trip, the skinwalker appeared. That evening they were enjoying a campfire when one of the friends noticed a pair of amber eyes peering at them through the darkness of the trees. The group went silent and stared at the eyes. Then it showed itself. It slowly walked out of the trees on its hind legs and entered into their field of vision. M described it as a tall, nearly bone-thin, zombie, coyote humanoid. That's all she had to say about it. I knew what she saw was a skinwalker, as that description was all I needed to have to know. Anyway, this skinwalker walked around the group at a very slow pace. The group was frozen with fear. Nobody dared move. The skinwalker was behind Trigger Happy when it suddenly snapped its head at M. It then smiled a broad and evil smile and began to walk toward M. M remembered Trigger Happy's face turning from fear to anger. He stood up, grabbed the closest throwable item, in this case it happened to be a hand-sized stone, and tossed it at the skinwalker, hitting it straight in the back of its head. The skinwalker turned and gave Trigger Happy an unsettling snarl and somewhat of a roar that more resembled a bark. Trigger Happy looked back at it with a challenging stare. The skinwalker snapped its head at M, then Trigger Happy, and then bolted into the darkness of the forest. The group packed up their gear and went to the car as quickly as they could. After some time they made it to the car, packed in everything as quickly as possible, and drove down the road to the nearest town. Trigger Happy at the wheel and M in the front passenger seat. M recalled thinking about the skinwalker's smile and glowing amber eyes. Suddenly the car came to a halt. M looked over at Trigger Happy and saw he was looking at something in the road with great fear in his eyes. M didn't bother looking. She knew that the skinwalker had blocked the road. Now, remember when I told you that this story shocked me? It was because of how extreme this part is. Now, like I said, this is not my story, so if you don't believe it, that's fine. I'm just telling the story the way M told it to me. Personally, I still am not sure whether to believe it or not. So anyway, the skinwalker had blocked the road. What M didn't expect to happen was when the skinwalker walked to the side of the car, it ripped the door off. The skinwalker then cut M's seatbelt off with its claws and grabbed M's arm. Before it could drag M out, Trigger Happy grabbed onto M's other arm, thus M becoming the item of a tug-of-war. The remaining friends were frozen in fear, watching this terrifying struggle between man and beast. After what seemed like ages, Trigger Happy couldn't hold on anymore and let go. M was dragged into the forest looking helplessly at Trigger Happy and the rest of her friends. After her friends were out of sight, she felt the fear of death. Then feeling came upon her. She described it to me as a feeling of determination, that she couldn't die. Not here, not now. She managed to get her arm free of the skinwalker after some intense struggling. She then ran off into the direction that she thought her friends were in. After a short time of running, the skinwalker had caught up to her, and she remembered being knocked off her feet. She turned around to see the skinwalker pacing towards her. She then noticed a branch under her hand. Before the skinwalker could grab a hold of her again, she swung the branch at its head, causing it to stumble backwards. She then dropped the branch and ran away. She didn't care where. All she wanted to do was get away. After some time of running, she stumbled across a cabin with lights on inside. She ran to the cabin and pounded on the door, screaming, "Help me, help!" M told me that before she could finish her next "help me," she ran out of breath from her being so tired after running for so long. Fortunately, a Native American man answered the door. "What are you doing here so late at night?" he asked M rather calmly. M remembered him as an older man. He was wearing tribal clothing, and he had a wise, calming, and powerful face. "You have to help me. There is something chasing after me." "What would this thing be?" the man said in a concerned voice. M then heard the same snarl and roaring barking sound she had heard earlier that night. She turned around, and sure enough, it was the skinwalker. "Ye Naldlushi," the man said in a dark voice. "Get inside," the man said to M, who basically forced her inside. She remembered leaning standing in the stranger's cabin, listening to him speak in an unknown language to her. Then she heard the skinwalker do the snarl and roar bark thing again, which was soon followed by the man shouting an unknown phrase. His shouting was so powerful that it made her jump. Minutes later, the man walked inside and put his hands on M's shoulders. He then told her that everything would be fine and that the creature was gone. She asked him what the creature was, and he told her that it was what was often called a skinwalker. M was allowed to use the man's phone to call Trigger Happy and tell him that she was fine and that they needed to go home without her. She was seeing a medicine man right now. The situation was explained more thoroughly, and eventually, Trigger Happy did what M had asked. M stayed at the medicine man's house for the night and for the next. During the time M had stayed there, she said she had been blessed by the great spirits to protect her in her future. She didn't go into detail. After her time with the medicine man drove her to the nearest airport and bought her a ticket to the earliest flight to Michigan. Before she left the state, the medicine man prayed over her for the last time. And that's the story that M told me. When I think about it, there is some rather interesting coincidences that happened in the story. Like how M and Trigger Happy had an item so quickly to attack the Skinwalker with, and how M coincidentally ran into a medicine man at the right time and place. Even so, all stories have a right to be shared, and every Skinwalker account has the ability to teach the world a little more about this creature's mysteries. This happened a few years ago in southern Utah. My family and I have some friends that live on the small sliver of the Navajo Nation reservation near the bottom of Utah. Our family isn't Navajo, but my parents had met some friends a while back who are. Now, my parents had always told me about the legends that their friends had told them. I was never really scared of them because, in all honesty, I didn't believe they were true. Well, we had talked to our friend Joey about coming down to the reservation and camping with him for a few days. He was on board with the idea, and we made plans to drive from Salt Lake City down to the campsite, which was about 10 miles into the reservation. It was a pretty average road trip most of the way, and we stopped by a few towns to take pictures and eat. But we had decided that we were going to make it to the campsite in one day. We had been driving from 6 in the morning to 3 in the morning, and we were all tired as hell. I had been sleeping in the back while my father drove and talked to my mother. I was woken up by my parents excitedly telling me we were about to pass the welcome sign to the Navajo Nation. I looked out the window and waited a few minutes before I could see the sign and kept my eyes on it until we passed. I remember intently watching the sign, waiting to feel the bump in the road where the pavement changes. As we passed, the back of the sign came into view, and I looked over the back seat to watch the sign until it was out of sight. But when I turned, I saw something standing behind it. It was a deer standing on its hind legs, but it looked broken. The entire form of the creature looked wrong. It stared at me, and I stared at it for the few seconds while it was still illuminated by our backlights. I turned back around and wanted to tell my mother what I had seen, but by the look on her face, I could tell she had seen it too. My mom explained what we had both seen to my father, who said it was probably a statue or something, and that we were just tired. My mom insisted, and my dad said we would ask Joey about it when we got to the campsite. When we pulled up to the campsite, Joey and 2 of his buddies were sitting around a campfire talking. We said hello, hugged, and greeted each other and began setting up our tent. Once we had gotten all set up, my mother and I got in the tent and started to go to sleep while my father stayed outside to talk to Joey for a little bit. I wasn't really listening as they were talking, but I started paying attention as my dad began asking Joey about the creature we had seen. Right as my father got to the description of it, Joey became quiet, and I could hear him whispering to my father in a hurried tone. All I could hear my dad say was, "But we just got here." About a minute after that, my dad was in the tent shooing us out, telling us we needed to go. My mother and I were annoyed by this until we saw that Joey and his friends were also packing up their stuff as quickly as they could. I asked what was going on, but the only answer I could get was, "Just get in the car." The scariest part at that moment was the way Joey was looking around the campsite. He was holding his rifle and looked absolutely terrified, which was something I had never seen before. As soon as we got everything in the cars, Joey told us we needed to stay somewhere off the reservation and that he and his friends would escort us. He made it very clear that we needed to stay on the phone with him until we got to a hotel. We all agreed and began to drive back from where we came. It was mostly a silent ride until we started coming up on a wall of rocks in the road. As soon as we could tell what it was, Joey was screaming in the phone that we needed to either go through it or go around, and we needed to do it quickly. We went around the rocks, careful not to pop a tire while still trying to make it out of there quickly. As we started pulling back onto the road, we heard a scream, or more like a garbled screech, coming from in front of the car, maybe 50 feet away. Joey only said go, which was enough to prompt my dad into driving faster than he had ever driven before. We made it to a hotel, and Joey refused to speak about what had just happened. The only thing he said was that we need a blessing of sorts before we left. We didn't want to, but seeing what had happened earlier, we were just going to go with whatever Joey wanted. I never really believed in skinwalkers, but after reading up on them and comparing the stories online to my own, I firmly believe they are out there. I am an off-road truck driver in Russia. Sounds a little bland, doesn't it? Well, it isn't. I have to drive a large all-wheel drive truck through the wilderness, hauling logs, fuel, etc. The truck that I drive is an 8-wheeled Maz truck. The incident that I'm going to relate has shaken me to my very core, and I nearly quit my job because of it. So here goes. It was late September, as I recall, and the nights were getting colder as the days passed. On this particular evening, I was tasked with driving some logs to a sawmill about 50 miles away from headquarters. I was going to object until my boss told me that I would be paid a large sum of money for this job, so I accepted. I went out, started my truck, and backed the logging trailer towards the log pile. The loading process went without any trouble, and I set out on my journey. Now let me tell you something about being an off-road trucker. The Russian wilderness is absolutely beautiful during the day. But when the sun sets, it's an entirely different. The trees form a near impenetrable wall of darkness, and navigating through this is hell for me, even with a GPS. The trip to the mill was uneventful, as it usually is. Nothing more than a pit stop at a fuel station. I dropped off the logs at 9 p.m. and went on my way. As I stated before, driving through a forest at night is hell, and tonight was no exception. I was getting more and more tired as the miles wore on, partially from the cold, my truck's heater was broken, and from general tiredness. I was just about to stop and sleep in the cab when I heard a noise, like a woman screaming. It was very loud, as my truck's engine tended to drown out just about everything. I slammed on the brakes, grabbed my flashlight, switched off the engine, and jumped out. "Is anyone there?" I called into the darkness. No answer. I advanced a few steps eastward. "Hello?" Again, nothing. There was a loud crack to my left, and I spun around, shining my light at the source of the noise. I froze at what I saw. It stood about 15 feet away from me, staring at me. "Hey, she, IT stared at me with large, unblinking canine eyes. Its legs were long and thin, but not at all bony. Its arms were of the same description. It wore a large wolf's head, while the rest of the wolf skin was used for additional clothing. It grinned widely, as if it were overjoyed that I had been stupid enough to gaze upon it. It pointed a clawed finger at me, opened its mouth, and screamed. It was the same scream that had caused me to stop in the first place. I began backpedaling towards my truck, never taking my eyes off the thing. I scrambled in the cab and frantically jammed the key into the starter. I put the truck into gear and floored the accelerator. The engine groaned in protest, but I paid it no mind. When I was moving at cruising speed, I looked in the mirror and saw the creature running on all fours. I downshifted and floored it. The creature's outline began to fade as the distance between us increased. After a few miles, the creature was no longer in my mirror. Confident that I had evaded my pursuer, I stopped in a clearing and relaxed. I went to sleep and awoke at 7:30. I remember the time because of my truck's dash clock. On a whim, I got out of the truck and walked around checking for anything suspicious. I froze when I saw the engine housing behind the cab. There were long scratch marks along the length of the housing. What's worse is that my truck had shifted position. It was directly parallel to the forest path the previous night, but now it was perpendicular to it. For this to happen, it would require a massive amount of strength, as these trucks weigh many tons. I climbed back into the cab and drove the remaining miles back to headquarters. My boss read me the riot act for the scratches, and I simply nodded and agreed with everything he said, as I was too tired and shaken to argue. I was demoted to doing paperwork for a short time as punishment, which was fine by me. In my spare time, I did some research in hopes of getting some answers, and I discovered that what I had seen was known in the U.S. as a skinwalker, a creature of Native American legend. It wears the skins of large animals as clothes, mimics voices, and preys upon humans. It was during my research that I had a very disturbing thought. If it was primarily a U.S. legend, how in the devil did it arrive in Russia? Needless to say, I requested a different route after I was promoted again. Thanks for the opportunity. This is my first time sharing this experience out of my inner circle. Well, here it goes. This took place during the last weekend of July last year. I was working for a local steel mill and was on the overnight shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I was the only laborer on shift that night, and it started out well. I did my usual rundown of tasks inside, but it all started to get weird when I would have to go outside. I'm warping up with the last of my indoor task, getting ready to take stuff out to the hopper. I go out as usual, loading up the hopper, and I feel something watching me. I look back and see this lone deer in the tree line looking over. Wasn't too uncommon for the deer to come about, however this one seemed odd. Especially since the deer would be in a group, this one however was alone. Didn't put too much thought into it, and I proceeded with finishing up my outdoor task and made my way back in. It was after this point when things would start to feel weird. There was a heavy presence in the air, followed up with a smell of rot and decay. The smell was horrible. Though none of my coworkers seemed to even notice it, I was nauseated. It also didn't help that I had a horrible headache as well. I kept going and just assumed maybe there was a bear digging through the trash. Some time passed, and the smell is still lingering, however it was only getting stronger. I was on the North Bay by myself. No machines were running that night down there, and the afternoon crew had left the one hatch opened up about a quarter of the way open. I was sitting down in the chair on the one machine digging metal chips out of the soles of my boots, and I hear a noise. I look and see nothing. Just assumed it was animal and went back to cleaning my boots. Well, I heard it again, but this time it was loud, and would only get louder. A knocking was coming from that bay hatch door, full-on knocking. I go over to check it out, thinking one of my coworkers was locked outside, but when I got over there, I didn't see anyone standing there, let alone a shadow, but something was knocking. At this point, the hair on my neck stood up. I wanted to close the hatch door, but something inside was telling me not to step near that door. I found an old broom handle, and thankfully the operating box for the hatch had the big buttons on it for opening and closing the door. I closed the door from a decent distance, standing on the elevated platform. As the hatch was closing, I could feel a sense of relief, but dread as well, especially after the door had just closed. I could hear this weird, disgruntled, deep throat growing sound. Sorry for a lack of a better description. It's the only way I could describe what I heard. At this point, I am freaked out. I slowly stepped away and began checking the side entry doors on the north wall now. Thankfully, the afternoon closed those early in the day. However, still with that being said, the knocking would increase and become louder, and not only louder but followed by scratching on the bay door. Followed up with more disgruntled sounds. I wrapped up my work on the north end bay and made my way back to the south bay. Not wanting to turn my back, I just slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on that damn door. I get to the south side and decided to peek out the main entrance door, that next to the punch-in time clock. I slowly made my way out and was shocked by what I saw. I see it but don't believe it, and I don't expect anyone who might be listening to believe it either. But I saw a floating, disfigured head floating in front of the north bay hatch door. It was just floating there with something orbiting around it. It was just there, almost like it was waiting for the hatch door to be opened. I freaked, ran back inside and into the locker of bathroom, went into the one stall and threw up. I was chilled to the nerves and shaking. I always struggled with my faith, but remembered hearing about the Lord's Prayer. I looked it up and started repeating it to myself, eventually finding myself praying. I ended up messing my friend that night and told him of some of the things that took place that night. Quite possibly the weirdest thing I have ever experienced, though it wouldn't end there. My final day at the mill, it was a Saturday in mid-August. I was on afternoon. It was storming that night. The bay door hatch was open this time around. We would unload trucks as late as 9 p.m. The driver and I were talking after, bullshitting. I signed the paperwork and he is on his way. Just as he left, a huge flash of lighting cracked through, and in the moment the lighting hit as it lit up the whole sky, that was the moment the skinwalker made itself visible. I still remember the deer skull head. It stood as tall as the bay hatch door entrance, elongated, and tatter cloth covered its body. Thanks for allowing for the opportunity for me to share this. I don't talk about it much and honestly try to forget the whole thing. Thanks and take care. This incident took place during the last weekend of July last year. I was employed at a local steel mill and was assigned to the overnight shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. As the only laborer on duty that night, everything seemed to be going smoothly at first. I completed my usual indoor tasks without any issues. However, things took a strange turn whenever I had to venture outside. I was finishing up my remaining indoor tasks, preparing to take some items out to the hopper. As I stepped outside, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced back and noticed a solitary deer standing at the edge of the tree line, observing me. While it wasn't uncommon for deer to frequent the area, this one seemed out of place. Typically, they would be seen in groups, but this deer was alone. I didn't dwell on it too much and continued with my outdoor duties, assuming it was just a coincidence. It was after this point that things began to feel increasingly peculiar. There was an overwhelming presence in the air, accompanied by a putrid smell of decay. The stench was unbearable, causing me to feel nauseous. Strangely, none of my coworkers seemed to notice it. To make matters worse, I was plagued by a terrible headache. I pushed through and attributed the smell to the possibility of a bear rummaging through the trash. As time passed, the odor persisted and grew stronger. I found myself alone in the North Bay with no machinery running that night. The afternoon crew had left one hatch partially open. I sat down in a chair near one of the machines, attempting to remove metal chips from the soles of my boots. Suddenly I heard a noise. I looked around but saw nothing, assuming it was an animal, and returned to cleaning my boots. I heard the knocking sound again, and this time it was louder and getting even louder. It was a persistent knocking coming from the bay hatch door. I went to investigate, thinking that one of my coworkers might be locked outside. However, when I arrived, there was no one there, not even a shadow. Yet, the knocking continued. At this point, the hairs on my neck stood up, and a feeling of unease washed over me. I wanted to close the hatch door, but something inside me warned against going near it. I found an old broom handle and thankfully discovered that the operating box for the hatch had large buttons for opening and closing. From a safe distance on the elevated platform, I closed the door. As the hatch was closing, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. Just after the door shut, I heard a strange growling sound that seemed to come from deep within, although it's difficult to describe precisely. It sent shivers down my spine, and I was thoroughly freaked out. Slowly, I moved away from the hatch and started checking the side entry doors on the north wall. Fortunately, they had been closed earlier in the day. However, despite that, the knocking persisted, growing louder and accompanied by scratching on the bay door. More unsettling sounds followed. I finished up my tasks in the North Bay and cautiously made my way back to the South Bay, keeping a watchful eye on the door, not daring to turn my back. Upon reaching the south side, I decided to peek out through the main entrance door next to the punch-in time clock. As I stepped outside, I was stunned by what I saw. It's difficult to believe, and I don't expect anyone listening to this to believe it either. But I witnessed a floating, disfigured head right in front of the North Bay hatch door. It was just there, hovering, with something or some things orbiting around it. It seemed almost as if it was waiting for the hatch door to be opened. I was overcome with fear, sprinted back inside, and sought refuge in the locker bathroom area. I rushed into one of the stalls and vomited. I was filled with a chilling sensation, my nerves on edge and my body trembling. Though I had always struggled with my faith, I recalled hearing about the Lord's Prayer. I looked it up and began repeating it to myself, finding solace in prayer. Later that night, I reached out to a friend and shared some of the unsettling experiences I had during my shift. It was undoubtedly the strangest encounter I had ever faced, but little did I know that it wouldn't end there. On my final day at the mill, a stormy Saturday in mid-August, I was assigned to the afternoon shift. The bay door hatch was open this time as we unloaded trucks until late in the evening, around 9 p.m. After conversing and joking around with the driver, I signed the necessary paperwork and he departed. Just as he drove away, a powerful flash of lightning ripped through the sky, illuminating the entire landscape. It was in that fleeting moment, as the lightning illuminated the surroundings, that the Skinwalker revealed itself to me. I can still vividly recall the sight of its deer skull head. It stood tall, reaching the height of the bay hatch door, with an elongated form and tattered cloth covering its body. Thank you for providing me with the opportunity to share this. I don't often talk about it, and honestly, I try to forget the entire ordeal. This happened about a year ago, last summer. Some background. I'm a 21-year-old non-Native American, 100% German bloodline. Male, and somewhat know about skinwalkers and wendigos, mainly from the massive amount of time I spent on 4chan in the past couple years. I live in the hills of the Ohio River Valley. I'm an avid coyote hunter and fisherman. What time I'm not spending at work, playing video games, or browsing 4chan, I'm in the woods or on the river. One night after I left work, I decided to go fishing at the pond on my friend's property, to the northeast of my house. I got home, grabbed my rods, tackle box, and trusty HK VP9, because I carry everywhere I go nowadays, and ran to the store and bought some chicken livers for bait. I should also mention that I brought my puppy, a 9-month-old German Shepherd Rottweiler mix that I named Mauser. As I arrived at my friend's property and began pulling my truck into the field surrounding the pond, the sun started to set. It was eerily quiet. No noises of nature or any noise at all other than the engine of my truck running. It made me feel kinda uneasy, but I just pushed it out of my mind. I got out of the truck with my pup and began to set up my rods when Mauser started acting a little uneasy. I patted him gently on the side to try and reassure him that everything was fine. By the time my rods were set up and ready to go, it was dark out, so I went back to the truck to grab my glow sticks and headlamp. It was then that Mauser jumped into the truck and wouldn't move. I asked what he was doing, almost expecting an answer. But instead I was hit with the most god-awful stench I've ever smelled in my life. The smell of sulfur and rotting flesh. I started to worry at that point. In an instant, every thread on 4chan that I've read about skinwalkers flew through my mind. I stayed still and silent for a second, listening. All of a sudden, I see Mauser start shaking and hear footsteps behind me. The stench of rotting meat grew stronger. My heart was in my throat, and I had completely forgotten the handgun clipped underneath my steering wheel. I stood there for what seemed like hours, even though it was only seconds. I slowly started to turn my head back towards whatever was behind me. About 50 feet behind me, barely lit up by the light back by the pond, was what I know was a skinwalker. I was horrified. It was easily 9 feet tall and had the head of a deer with scraggly antlers, as well as a deer's legs, and a human's torso, but it was rotting. Fight or flight had hit me at that point, so I jumped into my truck and slammed the door shut. I grabbed my pistol and rolled down the window and started shooting while trying to back out. I had my magazine empty in mere seconds and was out of the field seconds later. I had thought I was safe and that I was going to get away. I was wrong. I looked over and saw Mauser with all his hair standing up, teeth bared, savagely growling at something behind the truck. It was then that I felt the back of the truck drop, as if something had jumped into the bed. I didn't dare look into my rearview mirror. I kept driving towards the dirt road to take me from the field back to my friend's house. I heard a loud screech coming from right behind me. It sounded like it was close, but at the same time far away and coming from other directions. I drove for another 10 minutes, hearing tapping on my back windshield the entire time. Once I got back to my friend's driveway, all was silent. I gathered the courage to get out of the truck, forcing my pup to stay inside. If rather have something bad happen to me than him. This all happened last summer, so almost a year ago. I go back there to shoot and do target practice sometimes, but I always have a feeling of dread around that pond, and I can still hear the screeching sometimes, as if I could forget that sound anyways. This story hasn't necessarily happened to me, but it did to my older sister's boyfriend. For privacy reasons, I'll call him Emmett. Emmett is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and just returned from his mission after serving 4 months in Farmington, New Mexico, but spent most of his days in Arizona. For a young man who wants to serve a mission, he has to serve for 2 years before they can return home. And I won't be saying why Emmett returned after only being out in the field for 4 months. Now, over in other religious parts of the United States, he couldn't explain this story while he was out on the field. But now that he's back in Utah, which is where we live, he already has a terrifying story that he shared with me when he was visiting my family. Since I have short-term memory, I'll explain this story to the best of my ability. Emmett was in Farmington, New Mexico, and was staying in a trailer surrounded by desert playing games with his companion and 2 other missionaries. They weren't staying in the middle of nowhere, if you were wondering. Anyway, they were laughing and having a good time when they suddenly had a bad feeling come over them. It wasn't anything expected. It just washed over them like a tidal wave. One of the missionaries suddenly said, "They're here." Emmett was confused, but that dark presence he felt that night was too strong to ignore. So with some sort of natural instinct, they grabbed items to use as a weapon before opening up the back door. Emmett had a baseball bat in his hands, and he wasn't as scared. But when they stepped outside into the wild desert, all 4 missionaries were met to 4 dogs standing side by side in a neat row. Emmett described to me that they were bigger than any dogs or wolves or coyotes he's seen, but he knew they weren't dogs. The animals' eyes glowed yellow and their teeth were sharp and could tear anything, even 19-year-old boys. What stood out to him the most was that one of them was the biggest out of all 3 and was hunched over like it was about to pounce. They didn't have tails either. But what made this terrify me the most was when Emmett described how unnatural their eyes looked, mostly human-like. As intimidating as these dogs looked, Emmett's companion was stern and directive as he gave out a warning saying, "Go now, you have no power here." These creatures didn't like that as they let out a low growl, but 3 of them reluctantly turned and ran off. But the biggest one didn't. It crouched down lower, ready to strike. "This is your last chance. Leave now," Emmett's companion warned. It didn't listen, so Emmett's companion raised his hand in the air and began saying, "By the power of God, I cast out any evil spirits that walk among this area. I strip away your power." After speaking that powerful prayer, the thing began whimpering like a dog had gotten hurt. It let out a screech like no creature should in this world and began walking away. However, it fell down like it was hurt, but got up again. It fell again, but this time, when it stood up, its paws were replaced with hands. Human hands. Those hands looked like they belonged to a man's due to how hairy they were. The man-beast fell again, and the next time it got up, he stood up on 2 legs. That creature was a man. The man was naked, but had wolf skin to cover himself up. Since this vil man knew he was powerless, he didn't go back and just ran away, dropping the wolf skin in the dirt. Emmett and his companions stayed in their trailer the rest of the night and didn't come out until morning. They went to go check out the wolf skin that was left behind, and it smelled awful like it was dead for a while. It was dirty, rotten, and full of pure evil.